This Choircast podcast is brought to you by A New Way of Seeing, Meaning in Life and the Christian Vision of Nature. I'm Pierce Alexander Marks, the author of A New Way of Seeing. In our times, Christianity has been given a bad name. Fundamentalists and legalists of all denominations have obscured the fundamental moral teachings of the church. To be a Christian is to be in love with the created world and its creator, to find meaning in every moment of existence. Please take some time to read the book and become reacquainted with the true heart of Christianity. Thanks.
Welcome to the Unbelief Podcast, your journey, actually our journey together beyond inherited beliefs to a spirituality that works for you. I'm your host, Jeremy. I'm a deep skeptic, also a pastor. We can fix that later, right? No? You have made it to another book club episode of the Unbelief Podcast. You are welcome. We are in Christmas mode, and today we're going to talk about when Jesus was actually born, like the dates. We're also going to talk about all sorts of claims about pagan origins of Christmas and why we do the Christmas tree thing. It's going to be a whole lot of fun. So let's just start right at the beginning with like the birth of Jesus. And let's be clear, the birth narratives in the Bible contradict each other in a lot of different ways. For example, one of them has Jesus being born in Bethlehem. Another of them has Jesus being born in Nazareth. Now, we're going to nerd out on some of this stuff, and let's think through all of this in a way that we are being critical, but also having fun. And so some of this content is really a lot of fun, and we're just going with the fact that Jesus was born as a baby, and what the Bible says is likely the most accurate version of all of this. And so I know I'm a deep skeptic, and a lot of what we're going to talk about, I'm not 100% sure of, but it sure is a lot of fun to think about it and investigate it. So let's start with when Jesus was born. Okay, so there's this interesting story in the book of Matthew of the visit of the Magi, right? The Magi are these astrologers, which in the ancient world is really the closest thing I think we have to scientists. They really study. There is not the scientific method or anything like that, but that's who these people are in that world. And in Matthew chapter 2, it says that Magi from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star in the east and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with them, and he calls together, like, where is he supposed to be born? It says in Bethlehem. He tells them that, and then it says when the king told them that, they set out there. Ahead of them went the star that they had seen in the east until it stopped over the place where the child was. Now, stars are obviously in the sky. It's hard to imagine a star, coming down from the sky and, showing you the way like some sort of ancient GPS. I don't think that's what's happening. They're astrologers. They're people who study the night sky. The star that's leading them is a star that's moving through the sky in a way that is peculiar. And so what some people who really want to nerd out about this will talk about, astrology and where a star has to be and has to be moving to symbolize a king being born in this part of the world, and then sort of where it has to move again to guide them. I'm not going to get into all of those details because I will get them wrong. But the great thing is we have computers, and if you take all of these smart people's ideas about what these ancient astrologers would have thought, and you run the clock backwards on the night sky, you actually find a moment in time where where Jesus might have been born. The other place that we see, we hear Herod, right? And there are multiple Herods in the Bible story. So that's an important thing. There's Herod the Great, there's Herod Antipas, like there's 3 Herods that we see in the biblical accounts. But Herod the Great is the one who's talking here. And Herod the Great actually dies in the year 4 BCE. So that's 4 years before the sort of zero date that if you kind of talk about Jesus as being the dividing point between BC and BCE and CE, or the old version, which is BC and AD. AD would be Anno Domini, which is the year of our Lord, which references Jesus. This would be problematic because if Herod died in the year 4 BCE, that dating is off, and it is. And what is fun is when you run that clock back to try to figure where all the astrology stuff might have actually worked out, where the Magi were from and all of that. This is all theoretical, nothing 100% sure about this at all. But when you run the night sky back, there is a moment where it seems like everything might happen correctly, and that is the year 6 BCE. So if you want to take the Bible literally in this story and use that to try to calculate the year of Jesus' birth, 6 BCE is a pretty good year because it's 2 years before Herod the Great dies, and it seems to make a lot of sense. So what that means is that this podcast is being recorded in 2024. So that means that Jesus was born 2030 years ago. Ish. But let's talk about how we actually got the date, because the date of Christmas is a really fascinating story. And what's interesting is, like, for the first 3 centuries of the existence of Christianity, Christmas wasn't in December. In fact, it wasn't on the calendar at all. They didn't celebrate the birth of Jesus. It was something that ultimately develops later. Now, the first person that suggests a date for when Jesus was born is a guy named Clement of Alexandria. He lived from the year 150 to 215-ish. And he suggested that Jesus was born on May the 20th. Later, there are a couple of other dates that are proposed, March 21st and March 20th, neither of which is my birthday, but both of which are very close. But nobody early on in these earliest people suggesting dates suggest anywhere close to December the 25th. And so eventually we know it is celebrated on December 25th. We are celebrating it on December 25th right now. How do we get to this date? There's a couple of theories, a couple of stories that I think really all sort of swirl together in a perfect storm. And part of it is when they select the date and they start celebrating Christmas, Romans have their midwinter Saturnalia festival in late December on the equinox. On the winter solstice in December. And at the same time, in Northern and Western Europe, they had holidays also in that same region. Then in 274, the Roman Emperor Aurelian, he establishes a feast of the birth of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. He establishes that around this same time. And eventually that feast expands to 3 days and to an entire week. And it is a huge party. It is everybody in that culture having a great time, doing all kinds of wonderful celebratory things for the birth of a god. And so with the early church existing in these areas, it can be difficult, right? when you're a small movement and the rest of the world is celebrating a religious holiday, sometimes you just want to celebrate the holiday with them. And the early Christians were not about celebrating other holidays of other gods, of other religions in any way. And so there's a pressure. If we have not yet celebrated Jesus's birth, and if we are in a culture that is celebrating the birth of their God, then why not celebrate the birth of our God at the same time, right? Why not celebrate the birth of Jesus when everybody else is celebrating the birth of their God? And we can join in the celebratory spirit of the culture all around us, right? Now, there's a second, someone call it a second theory. I think maybe they're both true. Maybe they swirl around to make this all happen. And the second theory is based on the idea that at this time, they were much less concerned about the date of Jesus's birth and much more concerned with the Annunciation. And they believed that the Annunciation is when God told Mary that Mary was going to be pregnant. And the idea was that when God told her that in the beginning, that right when God told her that was when she got pregnant. And so when was that? That was what they were trying to figure out. And eventually, and it appears before the decision of December 25th, eventually they decide that the Annunciation was on March the 25th. That on March the 25th was when Jesus was conceived. And they also believe that that's the same date in the year when he suffered. But if you take that March the 25th date and you run it forward 9 months later, you get December the 25th, which, if it all happens like this, it is also just a very convenient date, right? It's a very convenient time for this all to happen because the whole world is celebrating the birth of their different gods, and we get to be part of that. One of the things that I think is really helpful and interesting about this is the way it positions Christianity in relationship to other religions, right? So the idea is that at this point, they are a small movement. They were not the dominant world religion, and that puts them in a different orientation, right? They are not in a place to say that everybody else is wrong. They're not in a place to have a fight about religion and about which God is the right God. They are not in a place as a sort of movement to look at them and say, no, your God wasn't born on that day because your God doesn't exist. They aren't doing that. Instead, they are engaging in their culture. They are engaging with this sort of festival mentality at this time where there are other religions, and they're allowing their adherents to celebrate the birth of their God at the same time, and not to feel like they have to be separate, that they have to have a different date, they have to be distinct, but instead to say, you know what? We believe something different than you, but we can celebrate with you. Right? We can respect your faith and your beliefs, and it doesn't have to challenge ours. It doesn't have to invalidate ours. It doesn't have to feel like we are being persecuted because you have different beliefs than us. Now, let's be clear. At some points in the early church history, they were being persecuted. But this concept at this point gives us this idea that, even though your fundamentalist pastor might say that living in a pluralistic world is a new thing and we have to fight against the pluralism, against the other religions, it's not a new thing. It existed like this. Christianity existed like this from the beginning. And so for those people who are Christians, they can engage with other religions, with other elements of the culture, with respect and treating those other religions with dignity, without feeling like, as a Christian, they are not somehow compromising their faith by being respectful of another faith, right? That's an important thing that I think this shows us, is like from the beginning, Christians at the earliest times were being respectful and living in a pluralistic religious community without the need to ruin everything, right? Without the need to like fight and do all that. Now, eventually Christianity gains political power and a shift happens. There are times when Christians are fighting or trying to dominate the world. But in this moment, we have an example of another path, an example that maybe we could choose to follow right now. All right. So that's the dating. But what about these trees? I mean, I've always found it weird that we take dead trees into our house and we decorate them. But there are all kinds of wonderful connections with trees in these winter festivals. Another festival that was being celebrated around the time that we celebrate Christmas. In the late medieval times, they celebrated their religion by decorating trees, like actually going out and putting decorations that symbolized their religions, their beliefs, their religious practices. It is very similar to what we do. They didn't cut them down and bring them in because they were celebrating the life that was in the tree. But there was decorations on trees in parts of the world at the same time that Christianity was spreading. And then there was this legend that developed. And I love this legend because of the way it connects nature into Christianity. And the legend goes like this. This legend grew that Christ was born in the dead of winter, right? When they celebrated it in December 25th, right? Christ was born in the dead of winter. Everything that winter, on the year of Christ's birth, every year, or it was the time of year where everything was dead. All the things had died and were dormant for the winter. But that winter, at the very moment that Christ was born, that throughout the world, every tree miraculously shook off its ice and snow and produced new shoots of green. I love this. I love this because nature is part of this understanding of spirituality, not in some sort of passive way, but nature is like an active participant in the Jesus story. And I think that sometimes when you look at Christianity and the way that some streams of Christianity approach nature, they don't approach it as anything spiritual, that it is just sort of an object. They objectify nature. And I get that. Scientifically, they're not the same as plants are not the same as animals. I understand, but I love this because it makes nature a whole other thing when it comes to spirituality. And that sort of leads into another part of the story of the Christmas tree. So in another part of the world, in Germany and in that area in this time, they had the idea of sacred trees. Now, in the ancient world, you've got to remember that winter was a dangerous season. Winter was very difficult. If you didn't cut enough wood, if you didn't store enough food if you didn't store enough food, people died of starvation, like every winter. And if winter lasted too long, it could decimate populations because there just wasn't food anymore. And so it was a dangerous time, and sometimes in the dead of winter, it was bleak in a way that we can't even imagine. I know that during winter, I will get sad. I will get bummed and depressed because the sun is setting too early and there is too much darkness in the world and in my life. And winter can be incredibly hard. It's even harder in the ancient world. And yet, in the middle of winter, in these forests, when everything else dies, there are evergreen trees. There is green. There is life in the middle of winter in the forest. And the evergreen trees were like a sign of hope that yes, winter will end. Winter will end. There will be life again. We just have to hang on. And so they celebrated these evergreens as sacred trees, and they'd have specific trees that they would go and they would circle these trees. They would dance. They would worship in these parts of the world. And the sacred trees, the hope in the darkness were a part of their culture. And then there's this moment where this pope named Gregory was sending out missionaries all over the world and all over the world in that time. And he said, look, when you go to a place, he said this to the missionaries, when you go somewhere, you need to know that God is already there. Right? You're not bringing God to people. God is already there. God has already been speaking. And so you need to pay attention, because when you find spiritual practices, when you find people worshiping, they are worshiping God, and you need to honor those practices and find ways to explain them in terms of Christianity. Now, that can be problematic. I understand. In the modern world, we have a word for that. It's called appropriation, and that's not cool. We don't want to appropriate the practices of other religions, but let's pause that. That concept was not around at that time, and let's just sort of stick with this story for a second. So they go to these areas where there are sacred trees, and they say, oh, yeah, we know this story. Look, when you've been worshiping these trees, these symbols of hope in the darkness, you've actually been worshiping Jesus. Yeah. Jesus was born in the winter, in the midst of the darkness of winter, and Jesus was the hope in the midst of the darkness. Jesus was the evergreen. That Christmas is sort of like the ultimate evergreen. And so they incorporated these trees into the way they thought about Christmas and about God. These early Christians did in Europe. And I don't know. I find God most accessible to me in general in nature, right? Like if I'm seeming like I am adrift, if I'm having a hard time feeling grounded or feeling spiritual, if I'm in a place where I feel like I am not sure if God exists, and if I'm in a place where I don't feel any sort of spiritual connection, if I walk out into the woods and just stand there, that will sometimes ground me. And when I find myself in Northern California, if I walk out into the redwood groves where there are these towering giants of trees, some of these trees over 1,000 years old, when I stand there, I don't know, sometimes it's like those trees are like antennas for energy, for the spirit, for God, for the unit, for whatever it is. Like I'll walk out into that forest, I'll stand there, and I will be like, oh no, I sense it now. I'll be grounded. I'll have the experience of the divine that I have been missing. And when I talk to people, that's one of the main ways that a lot of people encounter God. That's one of the main ways. Nature, right? Nature is one of the main ways. Not necessarily trees, sometimes animals, sometimes whatever. But nature is one of the primary ways that people feel like they are connected with the divine, the universe, whatever it is. And this incorporation of the tree is a connection to that. And I hope that if you are a person that has a Christmas tree, a tree in your house that is decorated, I hope that when you look at it, maybe you can be in the forest for a minute, that maybe that tree can be a symbol of hope in the darkness for you. Yeah. Maybe having that piece of nature in your house can help you feel grounded even when the world is swirling around. Because, man, the holiday season, with all the parties, all the gift buying, all of the family expectations, it can be overwhelming. And if you've lost somebody, if you've had a separation, if you've had family trauma because of, I don't know, an election, the holidays can be even more difficult for you. They can feel even more unsettling. And then when you add to it all of the actual darkness that you experience leading up to the darkest night of the year on the winter solstice, it can all swirl around to a place that is very hard, very hopeless. And I hope that for you, the evergreen, maybe you can look at it and say, look, this is not the end. The difficult time that I am in will come to an end. Just like the evergreens last through the winter, I can last through this winter too. I can get through all of the frenzy. I can get through all of the family drama. I can get through all of it because I know there is going to be an end to it. Yeah. Yeah. And I know that sometimes the like celebration that is everywhere and the gifts and all of the lights and all of that stuff can feel weird and awkward. But you know what? It's a dark time. It's a hard time for a lot of people in the holiday season. So just let yourself go. Find a night, drive around, find the weird holiday lights that people do, like the over the top stuff, and just enjoy it. Go to every Christmas party that you can find. If you have a Jewish family invite you to Hanukkah, go do the thing. Find whatever you can, just like those early Christians did, where they found ways to join in the celebration. Man, do that, because that kind of stuff helps when you're in a hard place and you can go to a place that is celebrating Christmas. Like, Google a bar that's having some sort of Christmas sing-along. I don't know what it is. Find karaoke. Do whatever it is to engage in the celebration, because that's one way that you can follow the example of the early Christians and participate in this season in a deeper way. So, yeah, I hope this holiday season is good. Also, the next book club episode that happens in a week, I'm going to tell you the story of Santa, but not actual Santa. Well, we will actually talk about how we got from the story of the real Santa to the Santa story that we have today, which is a fascinating thing that involves a children's book and all kinds of marketing. But I'm going to actually tell you the story that Santa is based on, St. Nicholas. It is fascinating. He actually goes to a church meeting and slaps somebody. You don't want to miss that one. So stay tuned for the next book club episode. It's going to be happening in a week. Also, we do this stuff together because sometimes when you're in a hard place, you actually don't need celebration. You need people, and you need people that are okay with you processing your religious confusion and all of that. We have that at a place called Not Church. It's a Discord community, and we call it Not Church because it's a place where people who are trying to figure out the beliefs that work for them, the beliefs that help them be a better person and find a greater purpose. People that are like that can be safe and questioning and processing without somebody telling them they're going to hell because they believe the wrong thing. If that sounds like something that you would like, I really hope that you will be part of it. You would love this group. The way you do it is you go to patreon.com/skepticpastor and patreon.com/skepticpastor. It's $3 a month. We charge $3 a month because we're not going to ask you to give 10% of your income. We want you to pay for what you get. If it works, great. If it doesn't work, you just stop paying. So I'd love for you to be part of Not Church. It's absolutely fantastic. I love that place. And wherever you're listening to this podcast, if you could give us all the stars and say something nice to us, that kind of stuff actually really does help spread the word. That's it. That's the podcast. Shout out to the Choir Network, to Pathos, to Matthew and Keith, who make everything happen. Now, get out of here. Go do something to make the world a better place, okay? We'll see you next time.